book list for 2022. I want to discuss 4 books that I thought were the most interesting books for me and gave me the most pleasure and interesting thoughts and intellectual curiosity, which is really what I'm looking for in books. I'm going to put the list in the show notes with all the books. If you are interested in any of the books discussions, I have every book that I finished, even those that I didn't. I have a podcast about them, so you can go and just do a search on the website. But I want to focus on 4 books just for simplicity here. And just for new listeners, why am I talking about books? Why is there a book list? I'm not Barack Obama or Mark Andreessen or anything like that. So it's not like I'm so important that you should know what I'm reading. But here's the thing: the purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense of what it feels like to run a hedge fund. I've said many times, I believe in Angus Fletcher's idea. He's an English professor at Ohio State, that literature is kind of like the conditioning of the mind. So it's like I compare it with an MMA fighter that trains. You know, she has to train technique, jiu-jitsu, fighting, striking, kickboxing, Muay Thai, but she also has to do conditioning. You know, the typical stuff you see on videos where they do push-ups and pull-ups and they run on the beach and they lift stuff and all that stuff. That's conditioning. And that's what literature is for a hedge fund manager. So yes, we need to know our techniques. We need to understand the financial techniques, the financial accounting, the cost accounting. We need to understand companies. We need to know how to analyze macroeconomics. Those are technical skills. But then we have the conditioning of the mind, which is the same idea. It's we have to be flexible, try to understand how to look at things from different perspectives. That's really what the knowledge business is all about. It doesn't just apply to hedge fund managers. It applies to anybody who, I would say, whose job is to sit behind to sit on a desk and look at a screen and not transact. Just have to fill out the screen somehow, either literally or maybe more virtually in a sense. I fill my screen, but I have to find ideas to invest in, so then my screen would show my portfolio, that kind of thing. So that's why we're doing this, and I think it's useful. I hope it's useful for people to just go through the list, understand what I'm reading. Maybe I can inspire some people. Maybe I get some feedback. I'm very open to feedback. Hey, this book, maybe you've misinterpreted the book, or that book is not as bad as you thought. I also, by the way, sometimes I start reading a book that I just don't like. I will put that also in the podcast. It's not going to be in the show notes. So I just want to focus on the books that I read. This is Not Even Wrong podcast. It's December 25th, 2022. This is Krim Delco. There is no updates in the market. We're down 71% for the year. The market's down roughly 21. We're underperforming by 50%. I'm going to have a more detailed summary of the year in a couple of days. Obviously, the main driver of this massive underperformance was Tesla, and there's a lot of reasons why. Some of it is macro, some of it is Tesla, but I don't want to talk about this in this particular podcast. This is, like I said, a book discussion. So let's start with the first book that I thought was really amazing, and that was Lenin, the biography of Lenin. Again, let's not talk about who wrote what and all the details. You can go and check it in the show notes or just search for the podcast. There's a biography of Lenin which came out a couple of years ago, and I read it, and it was really, really interesting. Why is it interesting? For a couple of reasons. One, it humanizes the person, because we always hear, growing up in Europe in the 70s and 80s, I always felt like this monster Soviet Union, and then you get a human behind it. There's a human, Lenin, I forgot his real name. And the book is really, really well written. It's almost as good as the Hamilton biography, because it's a narrative, it's a story. And this goes back to Angus Fletcher. It doesn't matter if I read biographies or novels or anything. In the end, it's about the story, because our human brains like to hear stories, and that's how we really process information the best. So what's really interesting about the Lenin biography, from my point of view, first, it's how the ideas of Bolshevism really got mingled up with the Tsarist dictatorship that was in place before Lenin came to power. That's one of the biggest ideas. That's why we have this special, I would say, perverse interpretation of Marx and Bolshevism as a result of that, because it was really embedded in, let's say, a secret police state and punishing people for speaking up. All of those things were already in place. This wasn't an invention by Marx or anyway. This was an interpretation by people like Lenin to solidify their power. So that's definitely one of the things. I think The other, a bit more scary thing is how relevant the conversation of Bolshevism is today. For example, we just had an attempt by Stanford to impose language on people, and you know, it just, I have to think of Bolshevism here. What is Bolshevism? It's the top-down thought coercion into, like, you're supposed to think like this, you're supposed to think like that, you're supposed to believe this, you're supposed to believe that. And we as a society, we sometimes think we're immune to that. Well, we're not. So we have to fight every day. Every minute of our existence has to be always geared towards the fight for freedom. We can't let loose. I just wrote a Substack essay, Academia Adopts the Language of Cowards. It's on my Substack. It's about this. It's how we need to protect academia and science. And this is, again, something that is very clear in the Lenin book. There was no science. There was no tinkering, engineering, and none of that stuff in a Lenin and later on Stalin type of Soviet Union. Yes, they came up with some amazing scientific feats like the Soyuz satellite and nuclear bombs and all that, but most of that stuff was stolen from the West and just copied. The ingenuity, the actual progress and freedom and all of that is necessary for real progress, for real economic growth, just wasn't available in the Soviet Union. That's why they eventually lost, and that's why we have so many interesting and creative ex-Soviet and Russian engineers who are thriving in Silicon Valley, because they are smart, they are interesting, they are all of that, but they just didn't have the freedom in a Bolshevik Soviet Union and later on in a Putin Russia, which is another continuation of the Bolsheviks. So reading Lenin gives you a good pretext for why, gives you a good intro for Putin. You know, Putin's grandpa was the cook of Lenin, so there's also nepotism and all of that. You can just see how all these things tie together. So that was, I would say, one of the more interesting books I read. Second book, Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. Now this is very different. Okay, it's similar in a certain sense, but then very different. First, it's a classic German novel. So this is not a biography or anything like that. This is a novel. It takes place in Davos, my favorite place in Europe. It's in the mountains of Switzerland, and it's a novel about the spirit of humanity. It's about what is knowledge, what is progress, what is there's really the two big counterparts, and I forgot the actual characters, but there's the one character, it's the logic, the logos, the word, and then there's the other one that is more open for the mystery. And of course, this intellectual sabble rattling, or whatever the word is in English. There's a German word, Säbelrasseln, that I'm just, translating very freely here. It just means you have two swords and you're kind of fighting. That's what it means. So we have this intellectual sword fight between the mystic and the rational, which elaborates in very, very precise and beautiful German language, and goes on. And there's no conclusion, of course. I think Thomas Mann, he's my favorite German writer for two reasons. One is that he has this ability to create characters that you can really sink in, and it doesn't matter if you like them or not. So he did that with Dr. Faustus also. And then the other is just he really picks the big topics. So, Thomas Mann is, to me, it's the stuff that science cannot solve. So he's really tackling the questions that science cannot solve. In other words, there's a lot of things science can do. Science can help us align our needs with nature. But science can't answer some big questions. What is the mystery behind the things we don't know? And why is it we know certain things and we don't know other things? And how should we deal with people that are different than us? This is a fundamental question that we're always fighting. I just said it in the Lenin discussion, where I discussed that Bolshevism is very, alive and kicking. Even today, here in Silicon Valley, we had Stanford trying to impose language on us. I mean, those are the first steps of Bolshevism, right here in the heart of libertarian wealth creation, freedom, all of that here in Silicon Valley. I live in Los Altos. I can see Stanford from my house. I have a roof terrace, and I can see the tower at least. I can see That's how serious Bolshevism is and how dangerous. And Mann asks those questions. Well, how should we deal with, let's say, somebody who wants to impose pronouns on us? We can call him asshole like Elon Musk. We can just suck it up and do it, and we're sheep. Or we can have a conversation. Listen, what is free speech? How do we deal with this? Those are interesting topics. They shouldn't necessarily be discussed on the Tesla board, and our CEO shouldn't necessarily buy Twitter and neglect Tesla and all that, which is part of the reason why we lost so much money this year. But they are still interesting questions, and I think they should be answered by novelists like Thomas Mann and not by CEOs. And I think Mann, again, he doesn't have a clear answer. The Magic Mountain is not a book that you're going to read and then come out and start a political party. It's actually the exact opposite. It's gonna induce some pretty strong humility into how you think about the world and how you deal with difficult questions. You know, how what's the right thing, the wrong thing to do if my child wants to do X and I disagree, if my wife wants to do Y and I disagree, if my mother, all the people that we love and that we're close to, they might be different than the way we think they should be, and then we have to find answers to that. Those are the kinds of big questions that a book like The Magic Mountain discusses. Now, just to finish the conversation about The Magic Mountain, I like the setting. It's sort of an isolated place. It's a sanatorium up in Davos in the mountains, so it's isolated from the world. It allows people to discuss difficult questions because they're not entangled with the daily necessities of survival and wealth creation and all of that stuff. And that's maybe the way we should deal with ideas, and that's why we maybe built universities and academia, and that's why it's so dangerous when we start mingling them with the real world. So we should keep our universities safe from the shenanigans of the real world as much as we can. And I absolutely don't want to use the word safe space because that's another Bolshevistic bully argument. I want to use the word safe and free, and that's very different. Safe from freedom, from taking the freedoms away. And freedom is defined as a voluntary exchange of ideas and behavior. Voluntary exchange of ideas and behavior. That's what freedom is. And there are certain things that should confine us. We shouldn't. I'm not an anarchist by any means. And I think the solution with the law and sort of the balance of power is the best we have. Maybe we can find better ideas, but that's a whole different conversation. So the next book I want to talk about is called The Great Circle. It's about a girl that grows up in Montana. This is a novel, and the novel it reminds me, let's say, it has some characteristics of definitely the Steinbeckian sort of West Coast spirit type, the spirit of the West type novel. It starts, I think, in the teens with some accidents happening in New York, and then somehow this girl ends up an orphan growing up in Montana. And it's funny, I just read another book where a similar thing happens, where a girl loses her parents and ends up in Montana. That book's called We Begin at the End. But let's get back to The Great Circle. So this girl, she grows up in Montana, becomes an aviator. So she flies planes in the 1930s. There's some bootlegging, some mafia stuff. And the girl just keeps going on and becomes a pretty big picture figure in the aviation industry, does some very important things, and then sort of the circle closes. I don't want to give away the plot, but there's some mystery. Is she dead? Is she married? Is she stuff like that? And the book goes all the way to the 1970s and then goes, sort of retrospect. And then also really, really good technique, I think, in a sort of novelist technique, because the book plays in the 19-teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, like that. But then there's also a contemporary character. She's an actress that is supposed to play this girl. So you have, and the actress talks from today. So she lives in the in 2000, whatever, 20 in LA, and she's an actress. And there's all this, she has sex with a producer and she does drugs and all that contemporary stuff. And it just contrasts with that girl, that spirit of that girl in Montana, becoming an aviator, a girl aviator, which of course is also a pretty big deal, particularly back in the day. It's still a big deal, a woman sitting behind the steering wheel of a plane, but back then that was definitely a big deal. So great novel, inspirational, typical. So in this Angus Fletcher spirit of conditioning my mind, inspiring me, giving me ideas, that's what this book really is, The Great Circle. So last book I want to discuss, The Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck. Look, Steinbeck's my favorite American writer and probably my favorite writer, period. And that has to do with many things. I live in California, not far away from where Steinbeck used to live. Actually, I'm an hour away from Salinas, where he used to live. So I live here, I breathe this air, I smell the soil, I eat the fruit from the soil. I mean, this is, and the vegetables, this is definitely, there's a connection there. There's some sort of entanglement. I did like Steinbeck even when I was a teenager in high school and we read Of Mice and Men. So I had always an affinity for Steinbeck. Maybe that's why I moved here. I don't know what the connection is, but Steinbeck's probably my favorite writer. And it's not necessarily because he's got this intellectual insight. I would say there's writers like let's say Thomas Mann, which are a lot more heavy and deep thinkers. But Steinbeck is just, he has that simplicity, that humility, and that wisdom that just transpires through these novels. Grapes of Wrath is a fantastic novel, helps you understand a couple of things, also really important things. For example, the homeless problem in California or the West Coast really goes back to the Great Depression when the Okies came and they lived in tents on streets. So in California and the whole West Coast is the place where people come, often desperate people with the last bit of hope, the last bit of money, the last bit of energy that's left, because for whatever reason they couldn't make it wherever they come from. Maybe it was the Dust Bowl that created the problem. They couldn't harvest their soil. Maybe it was political prosecution. Maybe it was poverty. Maybe it was criminal activities. They had to come here. So this place, this West Coast, always had this like welcoming, but also harsh reality. It's still there. Even today I feel very welcome here. But it's harsh. There's people on the street, there's drugs, there's a political problem in places like the Bay Area, particularly San Francisco and Oakland, where for some reason helping the most vulnerable people has turned into, if you ask me, a corrupt solution that helps everybody else but those people on the street. But they're happy because they can do their drugs on the street, and so we destroy a really beautiful place, and everybody's unhappy. So there's a lot of baggage, political baggage, social baggage, that I think the Grapes of Wrath give you a good sense for what it's like. But other than all of that, I think it's just a fantastic, typical Steinbeckian characteristic of the human condition. Just basic humans with basic needs and basic feelings and flaws, and then you have a narrative which is very simple, very straightforward. It's not easy, it's not simplistic, but it's very straightforward. And by the way, one interesting thing is also, if you now fast forward from the Grapes of Wrath to today, so we have sort of the westward movement of the pioneers and the Okies and people that are typically, let's say, looking for something better and looking also often maybe in a vulnerable position. That's why we have a lot of homeless people and all that. But now you have this new type of immigration, so the eastward immigration, so people coming from the east going eastward to California. That's a very different type of immigration. You know, the Indians and the Chinese and the Taiwanese, they come here, they're the engineers, they're the people that build this place, that build all those large companies and the market caps that are, you know, dominating California. So we have these two types of immigrations, which is just, I think, an interesting sort of side note that again, living here, you can feel that. So I live an hour away from Salinas. Maybe Salinas is the symbol of the Grapes of Wrath and the immigration to the west, and now Los Altos is the exact opposite, the eastward immigration with the engineers and the people that built this place. So again, to summarize now, the 4 books that I discussed here: Lenin, The Great Circle, The Magic Mountain, and The Grapes of Wrath. The whole list of the books that I read this year, 2022, is going to be in the show notes. And for people who are interested in more discussion about the books I haven't discussed in this particular episode, but I read in 2022, each book has its own podcast. So I've done a podcast for every book that I read, also the books that I didn't finish, some of the books I didn't like, but again, I'm just discussing now the books that I read. So they are being discussed, and if you're interested, please just do a search on our website. You'll find the discussion in the dedicated podcast episode. Thank you.